Imagine waking in the stillness of dawn, the air heavy with the scent of sagebrush and dust, only to hear the thunder of hooves and the cries of warriors as descending upon your homestead. In a heartbeat, everything you know, your family, your safety, your future, could vanish into smoke and chaos. This was not a distant nightmare. This was the lived reality for countless settlers and neighboring tribes during the tumultuous era of the American frontier, a time when survival was never guaranteed and violence was woven into the fabric of everyday life. The Wild West was a land of extremes, where vast horizons promised opportunity but delivered hardship, where freedom came at the cost of constant vigilance, and where conflict between cultures erupted with devastating frequency. Among the many forces that shaped this volatile landscape, the Apache tribes stood out as formidable warriors, survivors of a harsh desert environment who had learned to adapt, endure, and fight with unrelenting determination. Their methods of warfare were effective, brutal, and calculated to instill fear in their enemies. And within the violence that defined their struggles for survival and territory, women often became targets, victims of a system where power was asserted through cruelty and control. The stories of what happened to these women during raids, captivity, and the long aftermath of conflict are not easy to confront. They are stories of suffering, of resilience, and of a world where human life could be reduced to a commodity or a weapon. To understand this dark chapter of history, we must look beyond simplistic narratives of heroes and villains and confront the complex, often brutal realities that shaped the lives of both the Apache and those who came into contact with them. The Apache were not merely raiders acting out of senseless aggression. They were survivors, forced to navigate a landscape that offered little mercy and fewer resources. For generations, they had thrived in the arid Southwest, mastering the art of survival in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. But as European settlers expanded westward, driven by dreams of land and wealth, the Apache found their territories encroached upon, their resources depleted, and their way of life threatened. In response, they fought back. And their methods of fighting, honed over centuries, were designed not just to win battles, but to ensure that their enemies would think twice before encroaching again. Raids were a central tactic in Apache warfare. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to achieve specific goals: acquiring resources, capturing livestock, taking captives, and sending a message to those who dared to challenge Apache dominance. Women in particular became targets during these raids, and the reasons were manifold. Women represented vulnerability. They were seen as valuable assets, capable of labor, reproduction, and service. And capturing women from enemy groups served a dual purpose. It weakened the opposing community by removing mothers, wives, and daughters, while simultaneously providing the Apache with additional hands to sustain their own people. Once captured, these women faced a fate that stripped them of everything they had known. They were bound, sometimes with rawhide or rope that cut into their wrists and ankles, and forced to march for miles across brutal terrain. The journey itself was a test of endurance. Exhaustion, dehydration, and the relentless sun took their toll. Many women collapsed along the way, and those who could not keep up were often left behind or killed. The Spanish friar Alonso de Benavides, who traveled through the Southwest in the 17th century, documented the indescribable suffering of those taken captive by Apache warriors. His accounts, though written from the perspective of a European observer, provide a glimpse into the horrors that captives endured. But the physical journey was only the beginning. Captivity marked the start of a new existence, one defined by servitude, forced labor, and the constant threat of violence. Women were put to work immediately, expected to perform the most grueling tasks: grinding grain, hauling water, preparing hides, cooking, and caring for children. They were property now, stripped of their names, their identities, and their autonomy. And for many, the psychological trauma of this loss was as devastating as any physical abuse they suffered. They had been torn from their families, from everything familiar, and thrust into a world where they had no voice, no rights, and no hope of return. Among the most harrowing fates that awaited captured women was the practice of forced marriage. For the Apache, marriage was not merely a personal bond between two individuals. It was a social contract, a means of forming alliances, strengthening family ties, always, and ensuring the survival of the group. But for the women taken captive, marriage was something else entirely. It was a tool of domination, a mechanism through which their captors could exert total control. These marriages were rarely, if ever, consensual. The women had no say in the matter. They were assigned to men, often warriors who had participated in the raids that captured them, and expected to fulfill the duties of a wife without question. The psychological toll of such unions cannot be overstated. For these women, it was not just the loss of freedom, but the complete erasure of their former lives. They were expected to abandon their language, their customs, their memories of family and home. They were expected to bear children, to serve their new families with loyalty, and to forget who they had once been. And for many, this was a fate worse than death. They were trapped in a life that had been imposed upon them, unable to escape, unable to resist, and forced to endure in silence. But forced marriage was not the only form of suffering these women endured. Physical violence was a constant presence in the lives of captives. Whipping and beating were common methods used to enforce obedience and break the spirits of those who dared to resist. And then there was scalping, a practice that has become one of the most infamous symbols of frontier violence. Scalping was not unique to the Apache. Many tribes and even European settlers engaged in the practice, but for the Apache it served a specific purpose. It was a psychological weapon, a way to instill terror in their enemies and assert dominance over a territory. The act of taking a scalp, particularly from a woman, sent a clear message. To oppose the Apache was to invite a fate worse than death. Scalps were sometimes displayed as trophies, worn as symbols of victory, or kept as reminders of conquest. The origins of scalping within Apache culture are complex and not entirely clear. Some anthropological evidence suggests it may have been adopted or adapted from other tribes or influenced by European practices. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote of similar customs among the Scythians, noting that they made cloaks from the scalps of their enemies. While the context differed, the symbolic weight was universal, a visible, visceral reminder of conquest and power. In the Wild West, scalping became part of the brutal cycle of violence that defined relations between settlers and native tribes. Settlers, soldiers, and bounty hunters also scalped Native Americans, often motivated by financial incentives or revenge. But the scalping of women carried an added layer of horror as it targeted those who were already vulnerable and used their suffering to send a message of fear. Yet even scalping was not the most extreme form of violence inflicted upon captive women. Burning and mutilation were practices used not just to punish, but to terrorize. Women might be burned with firebrands, their skins seared and scarred to mark them permanently. Mutilation followed in many cases. Fingers severed, faces disfigured, bodies marked in ways that ensured they would never be able to forget what had been done to them. These acts were not random cruelties. They were calculated, designed to reduce captives to symbols of submission and to ensure that anyone who witnessed or heard of such suffering would understand the consequences of resistance. For the Apache, these displays of violence reinforced their reputation as warriors to be feared. They carved that reputation into the very bodies of their victims, ensuring that the message of their power spread far beyond the immediate conflict. Military records and settler accounts from the period document these acts in grim detail, describing the terror they invoked among those who lived in constant fear of Apache raids. But it is important to remember that violence was not one-sided. Apache women too were subjected to mutilation, burning, and worse by settlers and rival groups. The cycle of revenge and retribution fueled endless bloodshed, leaving scars on entire communities that would last for generations. The women who survived these ordeals carried those scars for the rest of their lives. Some managed to escape or were eventually released, returning to their communities forever changed by what they had endured. Others remained in captivity, their identities lost, their stories forgotten. And many did not survive at all, their lives cut short by violence, disease, or despair. Their suffering was not an anomaly. It was part of a larger pattern of brutality that defined the frontier, where survival often demanded unthinkable measures and where the value of a human life could be measured in terms of utility, revenge, or fear. As we look back on this chapter of history, it is easy to view it through a lens of moral clarity, to condemn the actions of one side or the other. But the reality is far more complex. The Apache were not simply villains in this story. They were people fighting for their survival in a world that was rapidly changing, a world that offered them little choice but to fight or perish. The settlers and soldiers who opposed them were also caught in a brutal struggle, driven by their own desires for land, security, and a future they believed was worth fighting for. And in the middle of this conflict were the women, both Apache and settler, both native and European, who bore the brunt of the violence, who suffered in ways that history often overlooks. The terrible acts committed against women during this era serve as a reminder of the brutality and complexity of frontier life. They reveal a world where power was asserted through cruelty, where survival often came at the cost of humanity, and where the most vulnerable were the ones who paid the highest price. These stories are not easy to tell, and they are not easy to hear. But they are part of our history, and they deserve to be remembered, not to assign blame, but to understand the forces that shape the world we live in today. The suffering endured by these women should not be forgotten. It should remind us of the capacity for both cruelty and resilience that exists within the human spirit, and it should challenge us to consider how we confront violence, power, and injustice in our own time.